If you're new to our channel, we'd love to have you join our little community. Just hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. We promise it will be worth your while.
The fashion show had been underway for quite some time now. Each model walked up and down the runway, showcasing her selected piece in a stylish fashion, and in a way that only she knew how. There was one model, however, that was not out on the runway. Rather, she sat glumly in her changing area, in front of her mirror, and stared at her reflection. From what she could tell, she was truly a beautiful woman, regardless of makeup. She had long flowing hair, a nice, toned, and even facial structure, and her lips were impeccable. She didn't have very big breasts, but they were big enough to complement her body and overall image. Her waist and thighs were slender, and she had sleek, long legs with sexy feet at the end. But for all of her beauty, with today being the anniversary, she just wasn't feeling very beautiful. The anniversary of what, you may be asking? Well, it was the time of when her beauty was first put into place and brought forth from within. The time when her life and body was much different than it was now. The time when she was actually a he. It all started one bright summer morning, when a boy named Johnny and his babysitter had gone to a hair salon. Johnny had gone all summer long without cutting his hair, and now with school starting soon, it was time. Not to mention his sitter had some catching up to do with her friends. As they walked in, his sitter, without saying a word, just dismissed Johnny to the back of the salon and immediately started talking and catching up with the present ladies. When Johnny reached the back of the salon, in the waiting area, he saw that there was a girl already there, swinging her legs back and forth and just patiently waiting to be called on. As Johnny sat down, he casually said, "Hi." The girl looked at him but didn't reply. Just by looking at her, Johnny could tell that the girl was younger than he was, although perhaps not by much. One thing that kept entering his mind was that the two of them had similar features. They both had long brown hair, and they were actually just around the same height. Then, while he was looking her up and down, she finally spoke up to him saying, "I like your shoes." "Where'd you get 'em?" "What?" Johnny said, looking down at his tennis shoes. "Your shoes. Where'd you get 'em?" the girl asked again. "A shoe store. I don't know. Why?" Johnny replied. "Oh, no reason," the girl said. Then, looking Johnny in his eyes, she said, "Can I try them on?" "What?" Johnny said, shocked. "No, these weren't made for girls." Not willing to give up just yet, the girl then said, "I know that. I just want to know what they feel like is all. And besides, weren't you just checking me out right now?" Looking back at her, Johnny replied, "They feel like what any shoe feels like, hot and humid. And no, I wasn't checking you out." "Well, in truth, I don't just want to try your shoes on," the girl said. "What does that mean?" Johnny asked. "I'll tell you what. Do me this one favor, and I promise I'll leave you alone." "Deal?" the girl asked. "I'm listening," Johnny said. "I want to try all of your clothes on," the girl said, "only because I want to see what it's like in the boys' restroom. I can't go in there as a girl. So, will you trade clothes with me so I can pretend to be a boy and go in there?" she asked. Johnny thought what she was asking was downright insane. But at the same time, she was driving him insane with her questions. So, he said, "Okay, fine. I'll go ahead and trade clothes with you, but you have to promise to leave me alone afterwards. Okay?" Excited, the girl replied, "Okay." Grabbing his hand, she suddenly yanked him to the other side of the waiting area, where a wall kept them hidden from open view. "By the way, my name is Jennifer," she said. "Hi, Jennifer," Johnny said as he was taking off his socks. When they both got down to their underclothes, they turned their backs and stripped naked. Then, in what seemed to be a dance, they carefully maneuvered over to each other's clothing without revealing themselves and started redressing in the other's clothes. Jennifer seemed to get redressed in no time, Johnny, on the other hand, had some difficulty. Jennifer had initially been wearing Hello Kitty panties, along with matching Hello Kitty shorts and shirt set. Not to mention, she had pink flip-flops on. Upon seeing himself in her clothes, Johnny wanted to gag, but finally, after a few minutes, they had switched clothes. "Okay," Jennifer said. "I'll be right back. I really want to explore the boys' bathroom." Then turning around, Jennifer immediately headed to the bathroom. But then, no sooner had the bathroom door closed when Jennifer's name started to be called through the salon. Johnny ignored it at first. His name wasn't Jennifer, so he didn't need to acknowledge whoever was calling. But as the voice started to get closer, he realized he was wearing Jennifer's clothing. He jumped up and started to rush towards the men's bathroom, but only made it a few steps when a tall woman rounded the corner and blocked him off. "There you are," she said. Grabbing Johnny's hand, she started to pull him out of the waiting area and onto the salon floor. And when Johnny showed resistance, the tall woman became aggravated and yanked Johnny towards her, saying, "Jennifer, now you stop that. Don't you want us to make you all dolled up and pretty? Come on now." Then leading Johnny by the hand, she took him to the shampoo bay. Placing him in one of the chairs, she had him lay back and got to work washing his hair. Johnny didn't want to be in this position. All he wanted now was to hurry up and change back with the real Jennifer. But as the hair washing continued, he started to feel more and more relaxed. He was actually a little disappointed when he was asked to sit up. It wasn't long before he was transferred to another station where a technician started to put rollers in his hair. And while his hair was being rolled, another person came over and started messing with his feet. She took his flip-flops off and with a nail file started cleaning up his toenails. A few minutes later, she looked up and asked, "Is there any specific color you would like, dear?" Not fully understanding, Johnny looked at her and replied, "For what?" The answer he received shocked him. "For your nail polish, silly." Panic filled him, and before he could stop himself, he heard himself saying, "Pink." And so, it was only a moment later when he felt his toenails being painted pink. Then, after all, his hair had been set in rollers. He was put under a dryer. And he had to admit, he was actually feeling a little comfortable. But then, a while later, reality slapped him in the face when he saw his babysitter at the front counter making a payment. And standing next to her was a boy with freshly cut hair and who was wearing the clothes he had been wearing when he first walked in. A flood of emotions filled Johnny as he watched his sitter and his imposter self walk out of the salon. And even more anger filled him when he saw the fake boy start hopping and skipping as she walked. But most of all, Johnny was filled with fear, because if his sitter honestly believed that the hopping, skipping child beside her was truly him, then what would happen to him? For Jennifer, today was a difficult day. She had been waiting for today for a very long time now, but she had also been afraid of it happening at the same time. But it had finally happened. She had finally been adopted. And now the orphanage she lived at was paying for her to be cleaned up, as they had put it. Just simply to make her look nice, she assumed. So here she was, sitting at the hair salon, just waiting for her turn to be worked on. The one thing about Jennifer, though, is she didn't really like being feminine. She was more of a tomboy, as some may call it. She liked expressing the rougher, more masculine side of her personality, and she was able to get away with that just a little at the orphanage. There were curious boys there who traded clothes with her all the time, and she was more than happy to oblige them in their trade requests, even down to her panties, clean of course. As she sat there thinking on her tomboyish life, she suddenly heard the electronic chime that notified when the front door had been opened, signaling someone had just entered. And not a moment after, she heard the present salon women get excited and greet the new woman who had just entered. Which, truth be told, didn't surprise Jennifer at all. What did surprise her, however, was to see a boy walk in with the new woman and start walking straight back to the waiting area, right towards her. Once he reached the waiting area, he politely said hi to her and then sat down. Jennifer looked at him, but didn't say anything, mainly because she was jealous. Here was a boy who got to be himself all the time, and he probably didn't even realize it. Whereas she wanted to be more of a boy than a girl. But with this new family she was getting, she was most likely going to be stuck as a prissy little girl her whole life. Even the boys she traded clothes with back at the orphanage, she was now jealous of them too. They were able to be the girls they wanted to be in some various way, so why couldn't she be a boy? But then, suddenly, a devious idea struck her. Trading clothes with boys. She had done it before. Maybe she could do it just one more time. And so, after much word play and simple annoyance, she actually convinced the boy waiting with her to take off all his clothes and put hers on. Then, she hightailed it the men's bathroom, and just as she walked in, she heard her name being called out. At first, she was scared, thinking she had been seen and that her trickery had not worked. But she cautiously peeked out the bathroom door to see her orphan manager walk up to the boy instead and start calling him by her name. Excitement flared through her body. It had worked. Then, slowly and cautiously, she slithered back to the waiting area and sat down, watching the boy as he was dragged off through the salon. It was only about a few minutes later when another woman approached Jennifer and said, "Johnny, haven't you heard me calling you? Come on, it's your turn." Standing up, Jennifer followed the woman and took a seat where she was told to. Her chair was turned around to face a large against-the-wall mirror, and not long after she heard a loud buzzing in her ear, which led to a sudden vibrating tickle that seemed to ripple through her entire body. She realized her hair was being cut just as long strands of her hair fell to the floor. Jennifer was full of excitement and truly couldn't help but be amazed with herself. She had tricked the boy into wearing her clothes, and now she was somehow fooling the adults so that she and the boy would actually swap places. She was now him, and he was now her. She imagined the boy was feeling all sorts of emotions, but she was just overwhelmingly happy that she finally got to be the boy she always wanted to be. Once her haircut was finished, Jennifer looked at her reflection in a bedazzlement. Her now short-cut hair helped make her look the part. And so it was. Once all was finished, she met the woman who had initially called her by the front counter as she was paying for the visit and saying bye to everyone. But Jennifer also couldn't help but notice, in a reflection in one of the mirrors, she saw Johnny being tended to and worked on. His hair up in rollers and his nails currently being painted pink. Inwardly, Jennifer started laughing at the sight of him and decided to do a little something just to show him what it meant to be a girl. As she and the woman walked out of the store, Jennifer started hopping and skipping as she walked. Now, she absolutely hated doing this sort of thing in all honesty, but she wanted Johnny to understand what it truly meant to be a girl. Then, as she was hopping and skipping, the woman looked at her and said, "Since when do you like to skip? I thought that was a girl's thing." Instantly coming to a stop, Jennifer looked at her and said, "Oh, it is for girls. It's just, there was a girl in there that I..." Looking back, the woman saw the girl being worked on and said, "Oh, she's cute, but you're a little young to be having a crush, aren't you?" Faking a blush, Jennifer just looked at the ground and smiled. "Oh, you devil, you," the woman said. "Wow, I am good at this," Jennifer thought. Horror-stricken, Johnny watched as Jennifer and his babysitter got in the same vehicle together and drove away through the parking lot. What was he going to do? Not only had he been abandoned by his caretaker, but he was now stuck in a world he didn't know anything about or understand. The world of the opposite sex. Incredibly, however, his answer came to him. The tall woman who had first dragged him to the shampoo bay was now back. He had been all dolled up, as they put it, his hair nicely rolled, and his nails painted. Now the tall woman took him by the hand and escorted him to the front counter, paying for the visit. And of course, every woman looked at Johnny with big eyes and said something like, "Aw, isn't she precious?" After the visit was paid for, the tall woman escorted Johnny out to a white van that had a red label running across it saying, "The Little Red Orphanage." In his mind, Johnny screamed, "She's an orphan." After putting Johnny in the back of the van, it seemed to take the tall woman forever to get in and start the engine. But just as she started to back up, she looked at Johnny and said, "Okay, sweetie, now that you're all cleaned up and looking pretty, it's time for you to meet your new parents." And with that, she turned around and drove away. It was around 20 minutes or so after leaving the hair salon that Johnny saw a peculiar red brick building come into view. And sure enough, just as the van approached it, he saw a large business sign out in front of the building, stating it was the Little Red Orphanage. Upon seeing this, Johnny was full of worry and dread. The woman he was currently with was ignoring him, making it more difficult to get out of his current predicament of looking like a girl. And the way things were going, if he couldn't get back to his normal way of life quickly, he wouldn't just be stuck looking like a girl, but he'd be forced to live like a girl as well. As he continued trying to figure out a way to free himself from his girlhood, the woman drove into the orphanage lot and parked the van. Then, after both of them were out of the vehicle, she took Johnny by the hand and led him towards two large double doors, as what Johnny could only make out to be the main entrance. Once inside, Johnny saw a long hallway, but was instead brought into an office room just beyond the entrance doors. The woman asked him to sit down and walked into a connecting office, saying to another person, "She's here." A moment later, a second woman came out of the adjoining office and stared at Johnny for several long seconds. Then, breaking the silence, she said, "Well, don't you just look marvelous?" Next, she ushered Johnny into her office and said, "I want you to change into something a little more pretty. That way, you will really look precious for your new parents when they arrive." "Okay, pumpkin." With that, Johnny was then escorted out of the office area and down the hallway to a small room that had a stand-up mirror and a couch. And on the couch was a frilly pink dress, pink lacy socks, and pink Mary Jane shoes that someone had laid out just for him. Once the door was closed behind him, Johnny just stood there staring at the dress. He didn't know what to do it. He felt so confused. He knew if he didn't put the dress on, he would eventually be forced to. And if he willingly put the dress on, he would just be digging himself deeper into this hole he was in. But the number one thing he was confused about was that he couldn't help but feel just a little bit curious. For some reason, he liked the way the girl's panties felt on him, and he was starting to take some pleasure in how his nails looked painted. And so, with much hesitation, he started to undress. He took off his pink flip-flops, along with his matching Hello Kitty shorts and shirt. Then he sat on the couch and put on the pink lacy socks that had been laid there. He loved how soft they felt. Next, he grabbed the dress and lifted it over his head, then dropped it down over his body. It was perfect fit. Lastly, he put the Mary Jane shoes on his feet one at a time and clasped the buckles comfortably tight. He stood up in front of the mirror and was truly shocked at what he saw. While he knew that he was boy, the figure in the mirror staring back at him was a very cute-looking little girl who looked to be a couple years younger than he actually was. His real age was 10, and he was about to enter the 4th grade. But by the way he looked now, you would think the 4th grade would be too advanced for a girl his age. Nevertheless, he couldn't help but marvel at how cute he looked as a girl. As he stood staring at his reflection, he suddenly heard a knock on the door along with, "Jennifer, are you almost ready? Your new parents have just arrived." Johnny was very nervous as he was led out of the room and back down the hallway to the front office. But it was when he walked into the office that he suddenly realized something. He realized that little by little, he was starting to enjoy being a girl, and then he heard something that truly made him feel special. The orphanage manager looked at him and with a broad smile said, "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, allow me to introduce you to Jennifer, your new daughter." A man and woman stood up together, grasping each other's hands. It was obvious that the woman was very emotional about meeting him, and while the man was likely feeling strong emotions, he was trying to keep them under wraps. The woman stepped up to Johnny and got down on one knee, saying, "Hello, Jennifer. I'm going to be your new mommy. My name is Courtney, and my husband here, his name is Frederick, or Fred for short. He's going to be your new daddy." All Johnny could do was stare at them as thoughts of his real mother started to enter his mind. "Ah, she's shy," Courtney said. "It's okay, sweetie. You don't have to be afraid. We won't have to be afraid. We won't hurt you. You're going to be perfectly safe with us, okay?" Standing up, Courtney gently grabbed onto Johnny's hand and started walking out of the office towards the orphanage entrance doors. Johnny now felt scared again, but for new reasons. This was a man and woman he knew nothing about, and they were quite literally kidnapping him. But the problem was, he was giving them permission by agreeing to become their daughter. He now was no longer a 10-year-old boy named Johnny, but instead a 7-year-old girl named Jennifer. And the most amazing part of it all was that he was now willing, and for that matter, curious what it would be like to be Jennifer. And so it was that the brand new Jennifer and his brand new parents walked out of the little red orphanage to a very nice car. "Oh, that's one thing we forget to tell you. Jenny. Is it okay if we call you Jenny?" Fred asked. Continuing, he said, "Your mother and I have money. We're not exactly rich, but we're not poor either." He said, "She's not going to understand that, Fred. Why do you bother?" Courtney said, "I know what rich and poor is." Johnny said, "And you can call me Jenny. I don't mind." Getting excited, Courtney kissed Johnny on the cheek and said, "Oh, you spoke. I was afraid you'd never speak to us." "Hey, Jenny," Fred said, "if you think our car is nice, just wait until you see your new home. And also wait until you meet your grandmother. You'll love her." "I have a grandma," Johnny said, excited and eager. "You sure do, little lady, and she's a blast," Fred replied. "Now, what do you say we all get going so you can meet her, huh?" Then, with everyone in the car, Fred turned, then engine on, and, looking in his rearview mirror, smiled. He finally had the daughter he always wanted. The drive from the orphanage to his new home wasn't too long of a drive, and at the sight of the house, Johnny's mouth fell open. The house wasn't a mansion, but it was still pretty big. As Fred was driving up the horseshoe in front of the house, Johnny spoke up asking, "Mr. Fred, what is it you?" Interrupting. Fred said, "Please, sweetheart, I want you to call me Daddy from now on, and Courtney too, call her Mommy, okay, sugar?" Feeling just a little embarrassed, Johnny replied, Okay, Daddy." "Good girl," Fred said. "Now, what were you about to ask me?" Johnny looked at him and said, "I was just wondering what you do for a job, Daddy." A big smile came over Fred's face as he asked, "Oh, well, let me ask you this. Do you know what a mayor is?" Johnny simply bobbed his head. "Yes, well, I am an assistant to the mayor. I help the mayor organize his office and arrange his meetings for him," Fred said. Johnny just stared at him, clearly not understanding what he was talking about. Giggling, Fred continued by saying, "Yes, it can be difficult, but don't worry, sweetie, you're a little young to really understand that type of work anyway." Then, looking out his window, Fred pointed and said, "Oh look, there's your new grandma." Johnny practically threw the car door open and dashed out to the older woman. He had never had a grandmother before, so this was a new experience for him. As he was approaching her, the first things he noticed about her were her hair, her body structure, and a very peculiar smell coming off of her. Her hair was a silverish type of gray that looked frizzy and frilly. Her body was slightly hunched over, and she was leaning on a cane. And there was an odd scent coming from her that Johnny had never smelled before. But most of all, the one thing Johnny noticed about her that really threw him for a loop was her breasts. They seemed as if they were 2 feet long and were just simply hanging free, fall down to the ground. Coming to a stop just a few feet away from her, Johnny just stood there and stared at her until she broke the ice. "Well," she said, "are you just going to stand there all day staring at your new grandma, or are you going to come over here and give me a hug?" Slowly creeping forward, Johnny was just starting to wrap his arms around her when she suddenly grabbed him tight and squeezed. He thought he heard laughing behind him while all the air from his lungs was draining out. "Okay, Mother, that's enough." "Let her go," Johnny heard Fred say. Instantly, the deadly hug stopped, and Johnny was able to breathe again. Then, while catching his breath, Johnny heard Fred say, "Mother, would you be a doll? Please show Jenny to her new room while her mother and I unpack her belongings." Suddenly, Johnny felt his hand being gripped, and he heard the old woman say, "This way, dear. Follow me." Walking through the house was almost like a maze. All kinds of lefts and rights, and a couple ups thrown in as well. But when they finally reached a large pink door that had Jenny written on it, Johnny knew he had arrived. Opening the door, the old woman walked in first, still holding Johnny by the hand. Walking in second, Johnny was taken aback at the sight of the room. Not only was the room large, everything was pink. The wall paint, the floor carpet, the bed sheets, and many other things. This truly was a room meant for a girl. Walking over to the bed, the old woman sat down and just stared at Johnny for a moment. Then she said, "Now tell me, who are you and where's my real granddaughter that I was expecting?" Shocked, Johnny suddenly felt a flood of fear and embarrassment rise up through his being, so much so that he started blushing and could barely speak. Continuing from where she left off, the old woman said, "My new granddaughter is supposed to have brown eyes, but yours are more hazel than brown. Not to mention, when you got out of the car, you spread your legs wider than any girl wearing a dress should, allowing me to see that little bulge in your crotch. You're a boy, aren't you?" Johnny didn't know what to do or say, but frankly, he had been caught. Feeling nothing but panic now, all he could do was stare at the floor, his face extremely pale. Around the same time, the real Jennifer was having quite the ordeal herself. She and Johnny's babysitter had long since arrived back at Johnny's home. The sitter simply dismissed Jennifer to Johnny's bedroom while she got on her phone and called her friends. Now, a couple of hours or so later, Jennifer had been in Johnny's room the whole time, going through his stuff and trying on his clothes. She was standing naked in the middle of his room, forking through his underwear, when she suddenly heard a car door being closed outside the house. As she started to quickly get dressed, she heard the front door open and someone walk in. Then a new feminine voice started talking to the babysitter, asking questions and making statements. It didn't take long for Jennifer to realize the new woman was Johnny's mother. After a few minutes, Jennifer heard the two women exchange multiple goodbyes and then the front door close. After that, not much was heard, except Jennifer heard Johnny's mother in the kitchen, preparing food, it sounded like. At that, Jennifer became excited. A real home-cooked meal, the first she would ever have. About an hour later, Jennifer heard Johnny's mother call for her. "Johnny, dinner time." Leaving the bedroom, Jennifer walked out towards the kitchen and sat down at the table. Johnny's mother had her back to the table, standing at the sink washing some dishes. "How was your day, sweetie?" she asked when she heard Jennifer sit down. "It was great," Jennifer replied with a little too much enthusiasm. "Oh, really? Johnny's mother replied, "Because Alice said you were acting strange today. That first you were against getting your hair cut, but then you suddenly were all for it. And that when the two of you left the salon, you were jumping and skipping." "What was that all about?" she asked. Going over to the counter, she grabbed a dish full of food and then turned towards the table to bring it to her son so he could eat. Halfway to the table, when she looked at the child sitting at her table, Johnny's mother suddenly dropped the food she had been carrying and developed a look of pure shock and fear on her face. "Who are you, and where's my son?" she asked Jennifer. Jennifer looked at her in mock surprise and replied, "Mom, I'm right here." "I know, it's the haircut, right? Is that why you don't?" Interrupting, Johnny's mother became angry and demanding, saying, "Where is my son? I know my own child and you're not him." Then, dashing to a phone, Johnny's mother dialed the police. Knowing she was in trouble, Jennifer jumped up and started to run towards the front door when suddenly a devious idea hit her. She turned around to witness Johnny's mother hanging up the phone. "Don't you go anywhere, you little brat," his mother said. "My son is now missing, and you're the answer to where he is." Faking a quiver, Jennifer replied, "Okay, I confess I'm obviously not your son, but I honestly don't know where he is." "You're lying," Johnny's mother replied. "No, I'm not," Jennifer said. "But think about it. I've been with that babysitter all day, so shouldn't she know something?" After several hours had passed, the police had ended up arresting Johnny's babysitter for kidnapping and decided to send Jennifer to an all-boys home, all of which being just as she had planned. Jennifer truly felt guilty for framing an innocent person just so she could have her way. But at the same time, she felt even better that she was now finally going to be able to realize her biggest dream yet, to live life as a boy. Johnny was as pale as a ghost. The only thing he could look at were his Mary Jane-clad feet. Then the old woman asked him, "Well, are you going to answer me or not?" And the only answer Johnny could manage to vocalize was, I. Fear had taken a solid grip on his person. His heart was beating rapidly, and he was even starting to sweat a little on his brow, when what happened next royally shocked him. The old woman placed a wrinkled finger under Johnny's chin and gently lifted his head up. Then, looking into his moist, slightly watered eyes, she said, "It's okay, dear. I'm not upset with you for being a boy. There are lots of boys in today's world who dress like girls and who want to be a girl. I'm not mad at you. No, not in the least. I'm just curious why you lied to us is all." Johnny again just stared at her, once more shocked at his outcome. The old woman was of the impression that he had intentionally portrayed himself as a girl, when that was actually the farthest thing from the truth. She looked at him and continued with, "We were told you were going to have brown eyes, whereas yours appeared to be more of a hazelish brown to me. But I guess brown is brown, so I can overlook it. What I really want to know is, why are you so interested in being a girl instead of being what you were naturally born as?" Swallowing his fear, Johnny looked at her and replied, "Well, because I like the way it makes me feel, and I would really like to learn how to speak and move like a girl as well." Johnny said, "Is that so? Well, I think I can help you with that. But what about your new parents? Have you told them that you're actually a boy?" the old woman asked. Johnny bowed his head and shook it no. Standing, the old woman replied, "Sooner or later, you should tell them." Suddenly, from out in the hallway, Fred's voice was heard saying, "Tell us what?" Then, Fred and Courtney both walked into the room carrying multiple bags of luggage, each filled with Jennifer's belongings and clothes from the orphanage. Everyone was now staring at Johnny, and he was feeling the heat of the moment. So, without thinking, he allowed another lie to come forth out of his mouth. "I still wet the bed," he said, shocked at what he heard himself say. He was even more shocked when his lie was accepted. Oh, that's okay, sweetheart, Fred said. Most children your age still do. That's nothing to be ashamed of. Placing the luggage down, Fred sat down on the bed, then picked Johnny up and sat him on his knees, saying, "Oh, you're heavier than you look. Wow." When the old woman heard this, a quaint smile developed on her face. "Don't worry about peeing your bed," Fred said. "We can buy mats for you to sleep on, or even get you diapers if you prefer, okay? There's no need for you to worry. Your mommy and I are wanting you to get comfortable with your new home and family. Don't be afraid to ask us for anything, okay, sweetheart? In the meantime, your grandmother here is going to give you a nice clean bath, and afterwards it will be dinner time, okay?" Putting Johnny down, Fred walked him over to the old woman, and then she and Johnny made their way down the hallway a short ways and walked into a large bathroom. Once inside, she looked at him and said, "Okay, Bee, go ahead and take your clothes off while I get the bath ready for you." Once again, fear gripped Johnny, and he just stood there in his pink clothes and shoes. The old woman was basically telling him to become naked in her presence, and the very thought of that made him feel very uncomfortable. After several moments of just standing still in fear, he saw the old woman turn around from the tub and towards him. When she saw he was still fully dressed, she said, "What's wrong, dear? Don't you want to take a bath?" Johnny replied, "I'm not comfortable taking my clothes off in front of you." "Oh, is it because you don't want me to see you naked? Is that it, dear? You don't have to be afraid about that. I've seen a lot of naked boys and men. I know what you look like. It's okay." The old woman replied. Still not feeling totally reassured, Johnny went ahead and started to slowly strip. First with his Mary Jane shoes, then his pink socks with lacy edges. Next, with the old woman's help, he took the dress off. And finally, after some goading, he very slowly slid off his Hello Kitty panties. Now, after several minutes, he was fully and totally exposed to the old woman. He had both of his hands covering his crotch so as not to show anything, but the old woman suddenly reached down and grabbed one of his hands and escorted him over to the tub, helping him into it. Then she started to lather up a wash rag with a strong scented soap and began rubbing the rag over Johnny's body, washing him. First his shoulders and back, then his arms and armpits next his chest. Then having him stand up, she washed his waist, legs, and feet. And then Johnny became really embarrassed when she took the rag and ran it back and forth over his crotch and between his legs. After that, she took the rag and swiped it a couple times between his butt cheeks. And last but not least, she took a portion of shampoo and conditioner and washed his long hair. Once Johnny had been fully rinsed and dried off, he not only felt truly clean, but he also felt special for having his new grandma clean him so thoroughly. After drying him off, she reached into the bathroom closet and pulled out a pair of pink onesie pajamas. "Here you go, dear," she said as she handed them to him. Grabbing the onesie, Johnny said, "Thank you, Grandma," as he started to put it on. And he loved the smile that developed on her face as a result. Then, walking to his room, he sat on his bed and loved the feeling of his new grandma combing his hair. After she finished combing his hair, she braided each side of his head into a pigtail. When all was said and done, Johnny looked at his reflection and truly adored himself. He looked just like a precious little girl. Once his new grandma had finished with his pigtails, she took his hand and led him to the dining room. It was dinner time, and he sure was hungry. Along the way, she casually asked him, "So, have you thought at all about what I told you earlier in your bedroom?" "What do you mean?" Johnny asked. "About you telling your new parents how you're not really a girl," his grandmother replied. "Oh," that Johnny said. Stopping, his grandmother looked at him and said, "You know, dear, your new parents are going to show you a lot of love and are going to make you feel very special. They are also going to give you discipline whenever they feel you need it. but they will discipline you like a girl unless you tell. Then now, you are a boy, and you may think right now that it's okay for them to treat you like a girl, but when you're older, you won't like it so much. Then, grabbing Johnny's hand, she continued on to the dining room. After dinner, the new family sat around just trying to make a little small talk. "So how was your bath, Jenny?" Fred asked. "It was good. I liked it," Johnny replied. Then Johnny's grandma looked at Fred and said, "Jenny was telling me in the bathroom that, because of her years in the orphanage, she never really had a lot of time to be very girly, and she would like to learn what it truly means to be a girl. And I think I can help her with that." Looking at Johnny, Fred replied, "Oh, well, I'm sorry you went through that, sweetheart." Then turning his gaze to Johnny's grandma, he said, "You think you can help? How so?" Developing what appeared to be a crude smile, Johnny's grandma replied, "My old ballet school should be able to help some, I would think." They were on their way the next morning, Johnny and his grandma, and along the way she talked non-stop about how she was eager to help him become the true authentic girl he wanted to be. At one point though, Johnny looked at her and said, "Grandma, I'm confused. About what, dear?" She replied, "Well," Johnny said, "you keep talking about how you're going to help me become a girl, but you have told me that I need to tell my new parents that I'm not actually a girl, but a boy instead. So, what am I supposed to do? Continue being a boy, or go ahead and try to be a girl?" His grandma looked at him and said, "Since you want to be a girl, then you should be a girl, dear. But what I meant when I said that you should be honest with your new parents about actually being a boy was that they should know everything about you, your likes and dislikes, your wants and needs, and most especially who and what you are and want to be. That way, they can be better parents to you and for you, and it is not my place to tell them for you. You have to be the one to open up to them in honesty and love. Doing that will take time, but in the meantime, I will be most happy to help you develop into a beautiful girl and woman." A brief period later, Johnny and his grandma pulled into a small parking lot and parked in front of a building with large metallic letters on top of it that spelled out SCHOOLL. However, just from looking through all of the windows, it was obvious that the building had been completely empty and unused for quite some time, and in the front window of the building there was a sign that read, "Up for lease." "Well, that's a shame," Johnny's grandma said. "It looks like it's been closed for a while now." Feeling defeated, Johnny looked at her and asked, "How am I going to learn how to be a girl now?" "There's no need to worry, dear," his grandma replied. "Your father found a very nice private school to enroll you in long before you came to live with us. And guess what? It's an all-girls school. So I can imagine they will have classes that can help you become a better girl. So don't worry, dear. Everything will be fine. In the meantime, let's leave from here." And so, leaving the ballet school parking lot, Johnny was of the impression that his grandma was taking him back home, when suddenly, out of the blue, she changed course. Wondering where she was going, he asked, "Where are we heading, Grandma?" "You'll see, dear. It's a surprise," she replied. Several minutes later, she pulled into another parking lot, a large lot that connected to a mini-mall. Driving through the lot, she eventually parked in front of the last store Johnny ever suspected she would go to, Toddlers R.S.R. Going inside, Johnny's grandma asked for assistance for her 7-year-old granddaughter, indicating Johnny. When the store clerk asked her if she was looking for anything specific, Johnny's grandma replied, "Yes, my granddaughter is still wetting the bed, so if you have any bed mats, and also some baby wipes so I can clean her first thing in the morning." About 5 minutes later, The clerk had a couple large pee-absorbing mats on the counter, along with several boxes of baby wipes. Johnny's grandma grabbed a box of wipes and asked the clerk, "Do you mind if I use your bathroom real quick? I may need to clean my granddaughter sooner than expected." Smiling, the clerk replied, "Sure thing. It's at the back of the store." Then, grabbing Johnny's hand, his grandma started to escort him to the ladies' room. Once inside, she opened the baby changing station on the wall and lifted Johnny up onto it, lying him down on his back. Then, she lifted his dress up and gnawed to quaintly slide his panties down to his ankles. Now that his maleness was being revealed, Johnny was embarrassed, so he asked her, "Grandma, what are you doing to me?" And she replied, "I'm going to clean your crotch, sweetie. Don't worry, it's just to help you get used to the feeling of baby wipes." And with that, his grandma opened the package of wipes, took one out, and commenced to clean Johnny's crotch. She was delicate and graceful in how she touched him, but at the same time, she was not hesitant in the least in where she touched him. And being a young boy who was just starting puberty, he couldn't help but feel a little excited by her involvement with his private area. And so, as she finished cleaning him, she looked him straight in the eye and said with a smile, "I see you enjoyed that very much, did you?" All Johnny could do was lay still and stare at the ceiling, for he had just been through quite the experience. After leaving the toddler's RES store, Johnny couldn't help but have a slight rise to himself for a little while. He knew his grandma wasn't trying to excite him in any way. It was just how his body had naturally reacted to her touching him down there. But at the same time, because of the excitement he had felt from her touching him, he now wanted to feel her touch him again. And so he came to the decision to truly start wetting the bed. That way he would get to be cleaned by his grandma every morning. As he was thinking about his grandma's touch, she suddenly touched him on the hand and asked, "What are thinking about, dear?" He didn't want to tell her the truth, so he quickly thought back to a woman he saw at the toddler store and said, "There was a woman at the store wearing high heels, and I'm curious what high heels feel like, since I've never worn that kind of shoe before." Well, his grandma said, "Would you like a pair of high heels? If so, I'll take you to the shoe store right now and buy you a pair." Johnny beamed, saying, "Really? Okay." It wasn't long after that when Johnny found himself sitting on a small bench inside a Payless shoe store trying on 1-inch high heels made for girls. His shoe size, for a boy, was a 6. So as a girl, he ended up being size 7.5 wide. The shoe clerk looked at his grandma and said, "Please don't take this the wrong way, but your granddaughter has large feet for her age. She gets that from her father." Johnny's grandma replied. It wasn't until about half an hour later that Johnny finally found a pair he liked, and he and his grandma were finally checking out. And he actually felt just a little more girly wearing a pair of 1-inch heels instead of his flat, Mary Jane shoes. Walking out to the car, his grandma stopped him and asked, "Have you enjoyed today, dear?" "Yes, I have, Grandma, very much," Johnny replied. "That's good, dear," his grandma said, "because we have one more stop before we go home." Taking his hand, she led him to the back door of the car and helped him in. As she was buckling him in, he asked, "Where's that, Grandma?" And she replied, "Your new school. Do you remember me telling you how your father enrolled you in a girls' school before we picked you up from the orphanage?" "Yes, I remember," Johnny said. "Well, we need to bring you to the school to have you fitted for your new school uniform. Won't that be nice, dear?" his grandma asked. "My school uniform," Johnny repeated. "Mm-hmm," his grandma said. "As of Monday, you begin the 1st grade." Shocked at what she had just said, all Johnny could do was look at her. Misunderstanding his stare, his grandma said, "Oh, don't be scared, dear. No one will find out that you're really a boy. And besides, it doesn't matter, does it? You'll be a girl in the future anyway." Closing the door, she got in, started the car, and drove off towards Johnny's new school. The whole way, all Johnny could focus on was the fact that as a boy he would be starting the 4th grade. But now, as a girl, he would be going through everything he had already learned all over again. His ABCs and his 123s, how to add and multiple, just the basics of childish learning all over again, which he didn't want to do. But he didn't want to be a girl, so he figured he would just grit his teeth and bear the learning pain and start his education all over again. The 1st grade, he thought to himself. Well, at least it's not kindergarten. It was now Monday morning. The first school bell to signify that the day was underway had just rang, and Johnny couldn't feel any more out of place. His grandma had helped him put his new school uniform on at home and had just dropped him off at the front of the school only a few moments ago. As he walked up to the front entrance of the school, he felt so many different emotions. He was nervous. He was afraid. He was happy. He was excited, and most of all, he was confused. He felt happy and excited because of how the skirt of his uniform kept brushing against his legs, and how his knee-high socks amplified the feel and touch of his skirt. He simply loved wearing girls' clothing now, and how looking like a girl made him feel. But he also felt nervous because of all the girls he was completely surrounded by. There were girls both younger and older than him all around, and he was sure that they would find out at any moment that he wasn't actually a girl, and that made him feel afraid. But above all of these excitements and frights, he was feeling confused over the simple fact that he felt like he belonged. How could he belong in an all-girls school when he was a boy? But then, he wasn't feeling very much like a boy anymore thanks to his grandma. As he walked through the school entrance, contemplating his feelings, a woman walked up to him and grabbed his attention by saying, "Hello, sweetie pie. Can I get your name and how old you are?" Johnny looked at her and replied, "My name's Joe." Jenny Taylor. And I'm..." Hesitantly, he continued by saying, "I'm 7. "Okay, Jenny," the woman said. "It looks like you'll be in Miss Riley's class. But for the time being, go join your classmates over in the cafeteria. The principal will be giving a speech soon, okay, sweetie pie?" With that, the woman dismissed Johnny and turned her focus onto the next girl walking through the school entrance. Johnny made his way into the cafeteria and sat down in the section labeled first graders. There were several girls already sitting there, but he tried not to give any attention to them as he sat down. However, he felt he must have done a poor job because the moment he sat down, a girl he knew nothing about slid over next to him and started trying to make conversation. "I like your hair," she said, referring to his pigtails. "I wish my mom would let me have pigtails like yours, but she only ever lets me have a ponytail." Not sure what to say in a response, Johnny just kept to himself. Then the girl held out her hand in offering and said, "I'm Jessica. What's your name?" Feeling a little nervous, Johnny looked at her and hesitantly replied, "I'm Jenny." Getting straight to the point, Jessica said, "Well, Jenny, would you like to be friends?" A little shocked, Johnny replied, "But you don't know anything about me." "Well, that's why we should become friends, silly," Jessica replied, "so that we can learn about each other." Johnny didn't want her to learn everything about him, of course, but what she said made sense to him, so he went ahead and shook hands with her. "Whose class are you in?" Jessica then asked. "I'm going to be in Miss Riley's class." "You," Johnny replied. "Oh, that stinks," Jessica said. "I'll be in Mrs. Tate's class. Too bad we're not going to be in the same class together." Then suddenly, in excitement, Jessica grabbed onto Johnny's hands and said, "Hey, I have an idea. Let's play patty cake." Johnny inwardly cringed at hearing her even suggest such a thing. But he wanted to keep up his girly image, so he decided to try and play along with her, even though he really didn't know how. Luckily for him, however, The principal got up in front of all the students and started making her welcome speech, just as Jessica started trying to play. Wow, save Johnny thought to himself. Once the principal finished her welcome speech, the students were dismissed to their assigned teachers, and upon entering Mrs. Riley's classroom, Johnny not only felt some déjà vu from being in the first grade, but he also felt a little uncomfortable, as he was just a little too big for the tables and chairs that were set up around the classroom. He slowly walked around the room, sort of taking in the sights, when Miss Riley walked up to him and asked, "Hello, are you in the right room?" Mrs. Riley was bending over and bearing her weight on her knees to help bring herself closer to Johnny's eye level. And in doing so, Johnny had a clear sight down her shirt, which distracted him. Yes, ma'am," Johnny replied to Mrs. Riley's question. "Can I have your name?" she asked. "I'm Jenny Taylor," Johnny said. "Oh," Mrs. Riley asked, putting a hand to bosom in mild shock. "I have a Jenny Taylor on my class roster." Looking Johnny up and down, she then said, "You're awfully big to be in the first grade, don't you think? How old are you?" To which Johnny replied, "I'm 7. "Well, apples and oranges, I guess," Mrs. Riley said. Turning around, she then mumbled under her breath, "Or a melon in this case." Then waving her hand, she directed Johnny over to a specific desk and said, "This is where I assigned you to sit, Jenny?" Walking over, Johnny immediately noticed 2 things. The chair and table with his name on it were made for a child half his size. When he sat in the little blue chair, he wasn't able to put his legs up under the table. Seeing this, Mrs. Riley said, "Try sitting on the floor and see what happens." Doing so, Johnny was able to fit comfortably under his desk, but he wasn't comfortable sitting on the floor. Mrs. Riley, however, pretended not to notice. It wasn't long after that other children started to come into Miss C. Riley's classroom, and the next thing Johnny knew, the room was full. Every seat was taken by a young girl dressed in her school uniform, and all eyes were on Miss Riley. For the first day of school, Mrs. Riley had a pretty simple curriculum. She just wanted to get to know her new students, and for her new students to get to know each other. And so, to make it interesting, she grabbed a little plastic bucket filled with pieces of paper, and she would have the girls put their names on the paper, then back into the bucket. Then she would randomly draw names one at a time, and the girl whose name she drew would stand up and introduce herself to the class and tell everyone something about herself. This was her usual method with her new class every year, but this year would be a little different. She would make sure that a specific student went first. Once the girls had written their names down, Mrs. Riley went back around the room and collected their pieces of paper. However, when she got to Johnny, she took his paper and hid it under the crook of her finger. "Thank you, Jenny," she said as she continued on to the next girl. Once she returned to her desk at the front of the classroom, she reached into the bucket to make as if she was going to grab a piece of paper, when in truth, she already had one. Lifting her hand, she looked at the paper and called out, "Jenny, would you please stand?" Instantly, Johnny became incredibly nervous, but just as he was building up the strength in his legs to stand, another girl stood. "Yes, can I help you?" Mrs. Riley asked. "You called my name, Miss Riley." "I'm Jenny," the girl said. "Oh, well, okay then. If you'd like to take your turn, go ahead," Miss Riley said. She was upset, however, that the other Jenny wasn't going first. Now she couldn't call Jenny's name again until several other girls had taken their turns, and she just had to know about Jenny. Like, why was she so big, for example? Mrs. Riley didn't get her wish at hearing Johnny talk about himself, though, because the lunch bell rang before he ever stood up. Johnny could feel Miss Riley's eyes on his back as he walked out of the room. But he was able to relax once he got a few feet past the door and started walking down the hallway. The lovely feeling of his skirt brushing him helped to soothe him for one thing, and then he got another little surprise. "Hey, Jenny, wait up," he suddenly heard from behind him. Turning around, he saw Jessica making a beeline in his direction. Then, only a moment later, there she was, at his side. "Hi, Jenny," Jessica said enthusiastically. "Hi, Jessica," Johnny replied, not so happily. "What's wrong?" Jessica asked. "I don't think my teacher likes me very much," Johnny replied. "Oh, she wasn't mean to you, was she?" Jessica asked. "No, but I think she knows that I'm catching himself. Johnny quickly shut his mouth. "Knows that you're a what?" What?" Jessica goaded, thinking quickly. Johnny replied, "Well, that I was an orphan. I was recently adopted, so I'm not anymore. But I still feel like I am sometimes since I haven't gotten used to my new parents yet. Oh wow, you were an orphan. I'm so sorry," Jessica replied. "Can we talk about something else, please?" Johnny said, truly feeling uncomfortable. Nodding her head, "Yes," Jessica then grabbed Johnny's hand and said, "Let's go eat. Then we can go outside and play. How does that sound?" Then together, still holding hands, then ran to the cafeteria to get their lunch. And with a girl holding his hand, running by his side, Johnny truly felt happy. Thanks to Jessica, Johnny's first day of school had gone by better than he had expected. It would. He did eventually have to stand up in front of his class and introduce himself, but he basically told his classmates the same thing he had told Jessica about being an orphan, and left it at that. He also noticed that once the words, "I used to be an orphan," were out of his mouth, Miss Riley's gaze upon him became softer. Whatever she was judging him over had been let go. At the end of the day, Mrs. Riley handed out a document for all of her students to bring home. It was a selection of various after-school classes or activities that parents could enroll or volunteer their children in. And there were a good amount of them that Johnny felt would help him improve his girly image. His eyes fell to dancing and softball, and he saw many other classes and events, but he didn't have time to really look while at school. His grandma was waiting in a line of cars to pick him up as the end-of-day bell rang. Running up to the car, Johnny waved his hand at her with a perky smile on his face. "I take it you had a good day," his grandma said. "Yes, ma'am, I surely did," Johnny replied and started telling her about his day. When he got to telling her about his new friend Jessica, his grandma said, "You've already made a new friend." "Outstanding. I had a feeling you'd make friends fast, but I honestly didn't think it would be on the first day." Once they got home, Johnny's grandma helped him out of the car, and on their way inside, she said to him, "Jenny dear, go ahead and get ready for a bath. You don't smell very pleasant, so I want to clean you now instead of before dinner, okay?" Excitedly, Johnny replied, "Okay, Grandma," and ran upstairs to his room. Then, practically throwing all of his clothes off, he was naked in a flash and in the bathroom in no time. He sat on the toilet waiting for his grandma for several minutes until he finally heard her open his bedroom door and walk in. Getting ready to see his grandma, he stood up and faced the door when suddenly his mother walked in. "Jenny." "Are you decent?" she asked. Immediately, Johnny covered his crotch with his hands and clenched his legs together at the knee. Hi, Mom," he nervously replied to her, afraid she had seen him. "I'm sorry, honey, I didn't mean to surprise you," his mom said. Opening the door and walking in, she continued by saying, "I just wanted to say I'm happy your first day of school was good for you." Then leaning down and hugging Johnny, she said, "And I'm so proud of you for making a friend so quickly." Lastly, she walked over to the tub and turned the water on, saying, "There you go, sweetie. That way you can be warm while waiting for your grandma." Then she walked out, closing the door behind her. Johnny just stood still, staring at the door, shocked at how close he had come to being discovered. It was only a few minutes later when Johnny's grandma actually entered into the bathroom. By then, the tub had mostly filled up with warm water, but Johnny was still standing in the middle of the bathroom staring at the door. Walking in, his grandma said, "Jenny, why aren't you in the tub? Come on, dear, let's get you all nice and clean and fresh." Then, she lifted Johnny up and placed him into the tub. With his grandma, Johnny wasn't the least bit shy or embarrassed to open his legs and reveal his private area to her. His mentality was she already knew. So why try to hide himself? And just like before, she lathered up a wash rag and cleaned every part of his body, from top to bottom and front to back. And also, just like before, once he had been rinsed and dry off, she handed him a onesie, only this time it was lilac purple in color. Finally cleaned and smelling good, Johnny was just about to leave his room to head downstairs when his grandma said, "Not so fast, young woman." Walking over to Johnny's dresser, she grabbed 2 pill bottles and asked, "First things first, do you have any homework you need to get done for tomorrow?" Johnny shook his head no, and was actually being honest. Then, opening the 2 bottles she was holding, his grandma took out a pill from one and a gummy from the other and handed them to Johnny, saying, "Take these. Drink water if you feel like you need to." Looking at the meds in his hands, Johnny asked, "What are these for, Grandma?" "The gummy is a vitamin for children. It will help you grow to be big and healthy. The pill is going to help you become a girl just like you want to be," his grandma replied. Looking at the pill bottles she was holding, Johnny tried reading the labels, and sure enough, one said children's vitamins, but the other one was a long word that he couldn't figure out. In his mind, he tried reading it out loud, saying, "Eastergen, Easterjohn, Astergen." But giving up, he took the pill and chewed on the gummy. Then his grandma smiled and said, "With that pill, you'll be looking and sounding like a girl in about a year's time." A year? Johnny thought. I don't want to wait that long. To help take his mind off of having to wait a year, Johnny decided to chug a lot of water at dinner to help him wet the bed while he slept. Somewhat astounded by the amount of water he was drinking, Johnny's father sarcastically asked, "Gosh, Jenny, you're not thirsty, are you?" Then giggled at himself. Courtney, on the other hand, was concerned. "Fred, this isn't a time to joke around. She's obviously nervous about something." Then turning her focus to Johnny, his mom asked, "Sweetie, what's wrong? Why are you drinking so much water?" To Johnny, though, it was of no concern. He was just trying to fill up his bladder was all. But thinking of a quick lie, Johnny said to his mom, "Nothing's wrong, Mom. It's just this water tastes so very good. We didn't have anything like this back at the orphanage." "Oh," his mom said, taken back by his answer. "Well, slow down on your intake, please. You don't want to get sick." Looking at Courtney with a blank expression, Fred said, "She can't get sick from drinking too much water. Don't tell her that." "I know that, Fred. I just don't want her to drink too much at one time and possibly throw up all over the place," Courtney replied with a slightly bitter tone. Seeing how his mother and father were starting to argue, Johnny became a little scared, as he didn't like confrontation. Then Fred suddenly raised his voice at Courtney, and for Johnny, that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. At hearing his father yell, Johnny quickly jumped up from his seat and ran away towards his bedroom, crying along the way. At seeing their daughter run off, both Courtney and Fred stopped arguing, got up from the dinner table, and dashed in the direction Johnny had gone. His grandma, however, stayed put at the dinner table. When Johnny got to his bedroom, he slammed the door shut and locked the door. Then he went and threw himself face down on his bed, continuing to cry. In his mind, he thought, "Why am I crying? Why was their arguing so effective on my feelings? Are girls really this emotional?" While he was thinking about his emotions, he suddenly heard a light tapping on his door, followed by, "Jenny, sweetheart, it's your daddy. Come on, sweetie, open the door. Your mommy and I didn't mean to argue in front of you and hurt your feelings." "Jenny?" After a short pause, Johnny heard his mother saying, "Jenny, it's okay, honey. You can open the door. You know we still love you, right?" Standing up off his bed, Johnny slowly made his way over to the door and sat down in front of it, with his back to it. Then asking anonymously, Johnny said, "Why did you two have to argue?" "It hurt my feelings." "We're sorry, sweetie," he heard one of them say. "But you know you're still our precious little daughter, right?" he heard the other one say. At hearing that, Johnny suddenly felt the anger rise up from inside of him that he couldn't explain, and next thing he knew, he yelled at his parents saying, "I'm not your daughter. I'm not even a girl, I'm a boy." For Johnny's grandma, silence rendered throughout the house after Johnny and his parents had run away from the table. She didn't like that her granddaughter was hurt and crying, but at the same time, she wanted Jenny to learn to overcome strife without her. So she stayed put at the table and continued her dinner. It was a few minutes later, however, when the doorbell rang, and since she was the only one available, she went and answered the door. When she opened the door, she saw a tall, thin woman standing there with a briefcase. The woman smiled and said, "Good evening, ma'am. I am a representative of the Little Red Orphanage, and I am the manager for Jenny. Is it possible for me to speak to her adoption parents for a moment?" Doing her best to hide her shock and fear, Johnny's grandma replied, "One moment, please. Let me see if they're available." Then, after slowly and politely closing the door, she quickly hurried off towards Johnny's room. As she made her way, Johnny's parents stood in the hallway in front of his bedroom door, both in a state of shock at what they had just heard Johnny yell. Fred looked at his wife and said, "Did she just say what I think she said?" Courtney looked at him and replied, "I don't think she's lying. I walked in on her earlier today while she was getting ready to take a bath, and I saw her naked. I thought I saw a boy standing there for a second, but I dismissed it because we're supposed to have a girl. But now that she's saying she isn't really a girl, but actually a boy, I think she's telling the truth." Not sure what to do, they were just about to try and continue their conversation with their adopted child, when suddenly, Johnny's grandma popped up from the stairs, huffing and puffing. "Mother," Fred said, alarmed, "what are you doing climbing all these stairs? You could have a heart attack." Between her gasps for breath, she replied, "Yes, I'm aware, but there's a social worker here to check up on you and Jenny." Doing a double take, Fred and Courtney rushed downstairs to meet the worker, surprised at the visit. Johnny's grandma, on the other hand, stayed with Johnny to try and cheer him up. "Jenny, are you going to come up, dear?" she asked. Hearing his grandma's voice did help some, but Johnny still didn't want to see his parents. And besides, the way he figured it, his life of being a girl was all over now. He had just revealed to his parents that he was a boy, so why would they want him anymore? Taking that into account, "Hi, Grandma," was all that he could manage to say for the moment. "Jenny, what's wrong?" Johnny's grandma asked. When she didn't hear a response, she lightly tapped on the door with her finger. "I yelled at Mommy and Daddy," Johnny then said to her, "and now they know I'm not a girl but really a boy, and they don't want me anymore." Tears were forming in Johnny's eyes. He had accepted defeat, and he felt it was entirely his own fault. But then he heard his grandma say, "They still want you, dear. Don't you remember that pill I gave you? The one that will help you look and sound like a girl in a year or so." "Yes, I remember," Johnny said. "Well then, don't worry, dear. You don't have to be a girl for your parents to want you. They still love you for who you are, not what you are." Her words cheering him up, Johnny unlocked the door and slowly opened it. Then he walked up to her and gave her a hug, saying, Thank you, Grandma. You're the best. I know, dear. Now let's go downstairs. I think your parents may need a little help from you. And whatever you may be asked or told, just say you're happy, okay? Dear? A little confused at her request, Johnny simply said, Okay, Grandma. Downstairs, several minutes had already gone by since Fred and Courtney had greeted the orphanage social worker and welcomed her into their home. She was basically just doing a checkup on the new family, wanting to see if everyone was happy together and how everyone was getting along. When Johnny and his grandma strolled into the room, the worker saw them and said, there's the precious little one now. Flipping to a specific page in her notebook, she got straight to the point and asked, Jenny, do you feel happy here? Fred and Courtney instantly grew nervous, afraid their spat at the table earlier would cause them to lose their new daughter. Understanding now what his grandma told him, Johnny replied, Yes, ma'am. I'm very happy. Fred and Courtney breathed a sigh of relief. That is, until they heard the next question. After writing in her notebook, the social worker asked, Jenny, your new parents haven't been mistreating you in any way, have they? Fred's breath caught in his throat, and Courtney felt like she could pass out. They weren't both certain now that they would lose their new daughter. Looking at the social worker, Johnny replied, Yes, ma'am, they have mistreated me. The worker clicked her pen deviously and stared at Johnny's new parents, saying, Have they now? Tell me all about it. Then, inwardly smiling, Johnny replied, They haven't given me the candy I want. They won't let me stay up late like I want to, and my daddy won't take me for ice cream like he promised. They're mean, developing a type of figures. Look on her face. The social worker looked at Fred and Courtney and said, Well, that's not quite what I meant. Then, after questioning Fred and Courtney a little more, she said, I think that just about concludes our conversation here. Fred and Courtney looked at each other, relief washing over both their faces. Courtney then asked the social worker, I don't understand. Didn't our daughter just tell you we were mistreating her? Looking at her, the social worker replied, Ha, not hardly. The majority of the children I interview have the same tendency to try and use me to get something they want out of their new parents, just like little Jenny here did with you. But the purpose of my interview is to find the truly serious situations new parents may be putting their new children in. Then, opening the front door and taking a step out, she said, As far as I can tell, however, you all make a good family. I'll be checking in from time to time, so let me have another good report the next time I visit. And with that, she walked out to her vehicle and left. Hugging each other, Fred and Courtney felt elation spread throughout their bodies. They were relieved they got to keep their daughter. That was when the full gravity of their previous conversation sank in. Their daughter had just recently admitted to not being a girl. So Fred looked at Johnny and said, Jenny, so tell me, why didn't you tell us sooner that you're not a girl? All Johnny could do was stare at the floor, holding his hands behind his back and gently smashing the toes on his right foot into the floor. That's when his grandma stepped up for him, saying, I think Jenny was afraid that once you knew about her actually being a he, you wouldn't want him anymore. Wait, you knew? Fred asked in disappointed shock. Yes, she replied, and I also know that the little boy standing before you is not interested in being a boy. He wants to be your daughter. He likes being a girl, and for that reason, I have started giving him estrogen. Alarmed, Courtney looked at Johnny's grandma with wide eyes and, in a loud voice, said, You what? You heard me? Johnny's grandma replied, That drug can be dangerous, and its effects cannot be undone, you stupid old hag, Courtney said. Fred touched Courtney's shoulder and said, Honey, I think there's something you're not taking into account. Then, walking over to Johnny, he got down on one knee and gently grasped his hand, saying, Jenny, I want you to know that whatever you decide, your mother and I will support you. If you want to live as a girl, even though you're truly a boy, then that's okay with us. Looking at him, Johnny replied, Yes, Daddy, I want to be a girl very, very much. Fred looked up at Johnny's grandma and said, In that case, Mother, now that we've all heard it with our own ears, go ahead and keep her on estrogen, but small doses for now. We'll take her to see a doctor soon. At hearing that, Courtney asked, Are you sure that's the best thing to do, dear? It's what she wants, Fred replied. I see no harm in it. But no matter what, we all must treat her like the girl she wants to be. Then looking back at Johnny, he said, And you, little lady, will have to start behaving like a well-behaved little girl. Is that understood? Looking at his dad, Johnny replied, Yes, sir. Rubbing noses with Johnny and smiling, Fred said, Good. Finally, the new family returned to their dinner table, but the food they had abandoned during their fits of emotion had already turned cold. And so, Johnny helped his parents and Grandma clear the table, then each of them went and got ready for bed. They brushed their teeth, the adults took a bath, and Johnny's grandma combed his hair for him. It actually wasn't long after he went to bed that Johnny fell asleep, but he had a bad dream that woke him up. Legitimately feeling scared, he climbed out of his bed and walked down the hall to his parents' room. But when he walked in, the room was dark and felt really cold. So backing out, he continued down to his grandma's room. Walking in, he saw that she was actually still awake, reading a book. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, she closed her book and took her reading glasses off, saying, Jenny, what's wrong, dear? You shouldn't be up so late. Johnny walked up to the foot of her bed and said, I had a bad dream. Oh, that's not good, his grandma replied. Lifting her blanket, she then asked, Do you want to sleep with me for the rest of the night? Gleefully, Johnny climbed into her bed and snuggled up against her. Good night, Grandma, he said. Good night, dear, she replied. The next thing Johnny knew, it was morning and time to get up and get ready for school. As he tried to stir himself awake, he couldn't help but notice that he felt extremely cold. He also felt a little wet down between his legs. Suddenly realizing why he felt the way he did, he flipped the covers over and found what he was dreading he would find, a large yellow stain in the sheets that he was laying directly on top of. How could I have wet the bed? Johnny asked himself. Then it hit him. All the water he had drank the night before at dinner had done exactly what he initially wanted it to do. Only he didn't want pee in his grandma's bed. Worrying she would be mad at him, he tried to quietly crawl out of her bed when she suddenly walked out of her bathroom, holding a box of baby wipes, and said, Jenny, dear, are you ready to be cleaned? Completely forgetting about wetting the bed, Johnny scurried the rest of the way out of the bed and over to his grandma. Take off your onesie, dear. It looks like you had an accident, she told him. Stripping naked, Johnny lay himself out on the floor and waited for his grandma to commence. Then only a moment later, she did. He felt the cleanse wipe first on his inner right thigh, smoothly going up and down. Then she lifted his leg and cleaned the back of his thigh and his buttock. Then she took another wipe and did the same with his left leg. Next, she took yet another wipe and gently placed it in between his legs, rubbing it on and around his crotch. This felt truly wonderful to Johnny, and he wanted it to never end. Taking note of his reaction to her touches, his grandma suddenly spoke up and said, You know, Jenny, once you're old enough, there are ways to make you a girl between your legs as well. Do you think you would like that? Losing some of his excitement from her rubbing him, Johnny replied, Maybe, Grandma. I don't know. I think it's too early to know for sure. You're right, dear, it is, she said, but it's definitely something to think about. An hour later, after Johnny was dressed in his school uniform and heading downstairs to eat breakfast, his grandma joined him and asked, Jenny, have you ever heard of beauty models? Yes, ma'am, I have, he replied. Well, I think that may just be what you need to help reform you. I found a girls' modeling class that we can take you to after school, if you want to try it out, that is. If you think that will help me, Grandma, sure, Johnny replied. Then he thought to himself, me? A beauty model? Wow.